The way most people in the West think about colonialism is not completely correct. The greatest lens to colonialism most people have is the American Revolution. Within this event, the main injustices defined by the anti-colonialists of the time was that Britain made and enforced laws onto the American colonies without their consent. As a result, the colonies fought a war of independence and took power into their own hands. While the lack of political independence is part of colonialism, for the majority of colonized countries throughout the world, the lack of control over economic resources is what defines colonialism. This form of foreign economic control persists to this day, regardless of the political independence of previously colonized countries, creating the circumstances for neocolonialism, the continued colonization of countries after major decolonization. In this video, we will first analyze British colonialism in India to see what defines foreign economic control, then we will discuss how the same systems which made colonialism economically viable in the first place continue to exist today in the form of multinational corporations. Colonialism in India was driven by a desire for British companies to make more money. India was not a poor place prior to colonialism. Indian merchants specialized in trading luxury items such as muslin, ivory, carpets, steel, pearls, precious stones, etc. From afar, these enterprises looked enticing to British corporations. The British East India Company was especially green-eyed about the prospect of involving itself in trade in India. Therefore, it raised funds through private shareholders to begin a colonial endeavor in the subcontinent. To be clear, the British East India Company was a private corporation. While it had links to British politics through regulation, it was funded by shareholders in London who were able to elect company executives and democratically decide on company policy. As a result, the goal of the company was solely to make a profit for its shareholders. The company's activities were centered around the Indian state of Bengal, where it traded textiles with local weavers. At the start of the company's endeavors, the weavers had relative financial freedom. They were paid better than even their British counterparts. However, this changed following the Battle of Plassey of 1757. In the Battle of Plassey, the company toppled the leader of Bengal and took the production of textiles into its own hands. As a result, it took measures to increase profit, which greatly hurt the Bengali weavers. The weavers were reduced to a position of near slavery. The prices at which the company bought their textiles were set by the company itself. The weavers had no choice but to sell their goods at that price because the company held monopoly control over the province following the takeover. In the same vein, the company used native soldiers and middlemen to manage the exploitation. As the company took over vast swaths of India, many native merchants tried to capitalize on the exploitation of their peers by working as brokers between native industry and the British. One specific example of this is Jamsetji Jijiboy. Jijiboy worked in the production and smuggling of opium from Bombay to port cities in China. He managed factories throughout the cities and supervised voyages. All this action resulted in Jijiboy making a fortune for himself while providing capital to the company and continuing the exploitation of the production workers of the factories. You may argue that the existence of a higher class of Indian society means that economic colonialism still allowed for some upward mobility. However, this is not the case. Jijiboy himself belonged to a community of Parsis that had owned land in the Portuguese areas of Bombay and Goa since the 1500s. The wealth they accumulated by owning land was passed down generationally. They acted as middlemen between the Portuguese colonists and the inner Indian trading systems, and they continued their role once the British arrived. As a result, the ability to act as middlemen for the British was only available to a select few Indian merchants, who had already accumulated wealth prior to the arrival of colonial powers. This situation is solely the work of a private company. Most people see colonialism as state actions of taking over land with vast armies and creating settlements in foreign lands. The reality is often very different. More often than not, colonialism is undertaken to extract resources from foreign lands. These resources are made up of raw materials, a production product, or labor in general. The example of the British East India Company is emblematic of the overall goals of colonial expansion. The company took investments from shareholders in London, used that money to buy products from textile producers in India, and sold those products at a higher price in Britain. The company then used those profits to buy more products in India and sell them in greater numbers. This served the company's primary objective to increase its value and create a profit for the shareholders in London. Similarly, decreasing the need to pay weavers enough to provide them financial security was another way of increasing profit, as it can increase the amount of goods it buys and sells. As a result, it should be no surprise that the company took the step of becoming a colonial power in itself. Similarly, if the primary purpose of a colonial endeavor is to extract labor and resources, then the issues with colonialism are the direct effects of these actions. Mainly, the native population that produces the goods, the people who created the actual value for the company, receive a tiny fraction of the profit. The majority of the money being received for the production of textiles in Bengal did not go to the Bengalis who produced them, but to a foreign corporation and foreign investors. Let's take a step back for a moment. The rebuke of colonialism just provided does not really mention the British government. It focuses primarily on the actions of a corporation. With this in mind, can we really say that colonialism in India ended when the British ceded political independence to India and Pakistan in 1947? It makes more sense to say that from then onward, colonialism took a different shape. The neocolonialism of today is defined by multinational corporations controlling industry in previously colonized countries, which are funded by American shareholders, and where most of the money made with the sale of goods created by native workers goes to these corporations and these shareholders. To begin, much of the industry in previously colonized countries is run by American corporations. While estimates are difficult to come across due to the level of privatization, around a fifth to a quarter of the industry in India is foreign controlled. This may not sound like a lot until taking into account that around 51% of the Indian workforce is employed in agriculture. As a result, a massive percentage of the actual industrial production within India is controlled by foreign hands. Similarly, much of the foreign-controlled industry employs exploitative business practices. Going back to the textile industry, multinational corporations such as Zara, H&M, and Walmart own huge sweatshops all around India that produce cheap clothing for Western consumers. Within these sweatshops are abhorrent labor conditions defined by incredibly low wages, while the owners of the corporations make incredible amounts of profit. You may be wondering, why don't the governments of these countries institute labor laws to solve the issue of low wages? The main barrier to this is the series of middlemen. Just like the East India Company, many of the sweatshops are managed by natives who make profit from the exploitation of their peers. These are, more often than not, the exact same families that profited from company rule. As a result, they have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo of exploitation. Similarly, because these communities have greater wealth, they have greater power to continue the organization that benefits them. They want to keep foreign corporations invested in their countries. As a result, many decolonized countries compete with other countries for foreign investment in industry by lowering the cost of labor and the wages they pay. This creates a situation where the economic exploitation of labor throughout the decolonized world continues to get worse. Similarly, an increasing number of people are displaced from agriculture and into industrial work because of greater investment. As a result, wages outside of industry and within agriculture have also decreased, creating a cascading effect of exploitation throughout Indian society, where different classes of people exploit each other, and at the top of the hierarchy stands the American corporations, making all the profit with the least amount of work, just as the East India Company had done during British colonial rule. Colonialism is not one nation taking over the political sphere of another. Instead, colonialism is defined by the extraction of cheap labor and natural resources from another region. The main motivation which Western nations had to colonize was based upon this access to resources. Therefore, it does not make sense to define it in terms of politics. Viewing colonialism as an economic system rather than a political system shows that, despite the decolonization of the mid-20th century, the systems which defined colonialism never went away. As a result, many historians define the term neocolonialism to define this new form of colonialism that very clearly exists to this day. This video serves as a very brief overview of neocolonialism. Many of the topics discussed were a very brief subset of the intense discussion that currently rages on about whether or not neocolonialism is an actual phenomenon. The thesis of this video argues that neocolonialism is indeed real, but there's a wide range of literature that, if you are more interested in the topic, or you do not feel fully convinced, you should check out. This includes, but is not limited to, the sources in the description.